you so much, Andre, for the nice introduction. Thank you all for joining. And first, I'm very sorry for not being able to join all of you in St. Petersburg, as was initially planned way before the pandemic. I've been many times to Russia, and I have many fond memories of all my trips there. But St. Petersburg is a place I've never been to. So, I'm still counting on being able to come at some point. I would like just to share my screen for today's talk.
Yeah.
This is part of a larger project to think about the role that styles of scientific reasoning may play in our understanding of science. I think it's very clear that styles of reasoning can be descriptive tools, and I'm going to say in a moment what I take them to be. And they are very helpful, I think, to make sense of salient features of scientific practice. I do think that they are especially helpful to capture continuity through scientific change. I think, for example, large-scale models that we have, from Kuhnian paradigms and Lakato's research programs and things of that sort, tend to actually introduce artificial discontinuities in the sciences. And I think there is far more continuity as long as you look at the large units of scientific analysis in a slightly different way. So, and that's, I think, what styles can do, and I'll try to indicate why that's the case. And one of the questions I want to address today is whether styles provide normative standards for evaluation of scientific endeavors, in addition to provide descriptive tools to make sense of the practice. And what I try to argue is that, yes, they do provide those things, and I think in an interesting and insightful way, but that we need to introduce in a crucial moment the notion of evidence to do that. Despite a variety of different conceptions of evidence, I think there is a core of the notion that remains the same. And that core is the one I'm going to try to articulate in today's talk and indicate how it can be used to support the normative traits of styles of reasoning. Okay, so that's what I'll be going to do today. So the notion of style of scientific reasoning has been discussed in the recent literature, primarily from Crombie. I think he's the main architect of that notion. He talks about styles of scientific thinking. Hacking proposed talking about reasoning as something more objective. I think Hacking is right about that. Granger has a discussion about styles in mathematics. And there's a lot of interesting work being done in the area since then, right? One thing I think it's important, however, is to distinguish scientific theories from styles, right? Styles are broader units of analysis. They do not depend on scientific theories for their individuation and their characterization. And that's something that has become clear as I go, will be something very important. I think if we subsume the notion of style under the notion of theory, or if we use the notion of a scientific theory to characterize what a style is, we run into trouble, because then we change the theory and the styles will change accordingly. I think that's one of the problems that the notion of paradigm, Kuhnian paradigms, face, because with Kuhn, a paradigm involves theories, methods, goals. So if theories change, paradigms change as well. And that's one of the reasons why we end up having large-scale paradigmatic shifts that introduce radical discontinuities in ways that I think are highly artificial. So I'm going to suggest that styles are better at trying to capture that kind of unity and continuity. Now, Crombie, when he introduced the notion of a style of scientific thinking, but I'm going to use the term reasoning, he did that in a sort of well, in a massive 3-volume, 1,500-page book that basically covers the entire history of Western science. And he identified basically 6 kinds of styles of reasoning. And just by considering these kinds, you can see how it sort of covers significant parts of the history of Western science. So you have deductive style, we have an experimental style, a hypothetic style, and those 3 are basically styles that focus on individuals primarily. Then the next 3 are styles that focus on populations and groups, right? Taxonomic style, statistic style, and an evolutionary style, right? So basically there are ways of asking questions about the world, highlighting certain strategies of inquiry, right? And you can see the strategies is highlighted by the name of each of those styles, right? You can make hypotheses, you can construct experiments, you can classify taxonomic certain things, you can study how to infer from particular samples features of the population as a whole, or you can study origins of things via their evolutionary traits. Now, one question, however, that Crombie did not explicitly or carefully address in his work is the question about the identity conditions of styles, right? Under what condition does a style remain the same, and when does it differ from another? And it's to some extent, Ian Hacking tried to address some of that. But one of the somewhat frustrating aspects of Hacking's work in that field is that each new work he writes, he ends up dramatically changing what he takes styles to be. So it's hard to square exactly what is the conception, right? And in one of the latest articles Hacking wrote about this, he even suggests we should give up the term styles of reasoning altogether. What we need, I think, here to answer the question exactly what is a style of scientific reasoning is to provide a little bit of conceptual analysis. And that's what I'm offering now. I'm going to suggest a sort of a format. It's not exactly a definition, but a format to think about styles. And then I'll indicate that actually it generates the understanding of the particular cases of style that Crombie identifies as particular cases. So what exactly is then, right, a style on the view I'm going to favor? So I suggest that a style is first an investigation strategy. That's what the kind of thing it is, right? So it's a strategy of investigating some aspect of the world. Now, this involves first a selection of certain types of questions to be addressed, right? So what are you allowed to ask within a style? Now, also, you need to indicate techniques and procedures, right? So it's not enough to ask a question, you need to be able to tell how to answer it, right? So techniques and procedures will be needed to achieve that. Thirdly, if you have a style of reasoning, you need to have some kind of standard of inference, right? Maybe a deductive standard, inductive, statistical, analogical, but some standards of inference need to be specified. Fourth, an heuristic resources, right? Those are helpful devices to solve problems within the style. And they are different than techniques and procedures. And I'm going to illustrate why this is a difference that matters here. And finally, the fifth component, ways of constituting objects in a given domain of the research. So to have a style is to have a way of conceptualizing a certain domain of inquiry, a certain object of investigation. So let's now, so as an example, let's consider the first of the 6 styles that Crombie identified, the deductive style, right? That's sort of exemplified in Euclidean geometry, in particular the elements that you find in Euclid, right? So first, what types of questions are asked? Well, those are questions, geometrical questions that can be asked using rule and compass. Well, techniques and procedures are exactly the rules and compass that constrain the construction of the objects in question. What are the standards of inference? Well, those are deductive inferences. And interestingly, of course, what was considered logic at that time, sort of Aristotle's syllogistic logic, could not be formulated could not formulate all the inferences that you find in Euclid's elements. So even at that time, there was a mismatch between, on the one hand, what logic says and what was needed for mathematics, right? Now, the fourth component, heuristic resources, you find in the use of diagrams. So, of course, we cannot try to do the Euclidean geometry, at least in the way that the elements is done, without those diagrams. And so those are the heuristic resources that are different from the techniques and procedures that are invoked in the style that invoke construction with rules and compass. And finally, the ways of constituting objects, right? So the geometrical conception of objects in the Euclidean geometry is done by rule and compass. So whatever can be done in that way, it will be part of the conception of objects at hand. So this is an illustration of how one of Crombie's styles fits satisfy the 5 components. So all 5 traits here needs to be satisfied in order for us to have a style, right? If time allowed, I could go over all the other remaining 5 styles and indicate why they also fit here. But for time's sake, I will not do that today. One important thing to highlight again is note that nowhere in those 5 features a theory of the domain in question is invoked. And that's deliberate so that we can avoid having change of theories entail a change in style, right? So you may have different theories under the same style and understand their continuity within that framework. So for example, very clearly, both Newtonian physics and say relativistic physics are part of the deductive style, right? They both can be formulated satisfying conditions of this sort. But they are different theories, right? But there is a continuity among them, despite, of course, the changes in theories. So that is an illustration of ways in which there might be continuity within science, even though there are changes in theories. Okay, now, when I first started writing about styles, many years ago, I had a simpler account of what styles were, and Baldock, in a very interesting paper, challenged the way that I was then understanding styles. And I was basically what I draw a distinction between broad and narrow styles. And basically what I was calling, sort of the narrow styles were what conditions 1 and 3, right? Namely, you have a certain types of questions to be asked, and there is an inferential procedure. And Baldock rightly complained that, well, to the extent that narrow styles are meant to be narrow is indeterminate. The narrow styles do not improve on the analytical capabilities of Hacking's concepts, and that Hacking's proposal, similar to Hacking's proposal, narrow styles are unable to capture the dynamic character of particular scientific practices. And I think just to a large extent, I'm then in agreement with the kinds of worries that Baldock was raising here. And I do think, however, that the framework I just presented in terms of these 5 features is better equipped, including to address those concerns, right? And so because we do have a richer understanding, right? So there are more components to analyze scientific practice with the 5 features. So both, it's clear in what sense the style will be narrower. We have more features to be satisfied. It would improve in the analytic capabilities of hacking because you have those elements to characterize details of the practice. And you can capture some of the dynamic character of scientific practices by understanding ways in which styles change. They will change once those features are changed, right? And so in that sense, there is a significant advantage. As I mentioned, styles should not and do not depend on scientific theories. They are broader than scientific theory, right? And they provide a strategy to investigate a certain domain. And I think this goes through whether you're considering empirical domains or domains that are not tied to experience, such as in mathematics. As I noticed, this is important so that we can avoid the problem of changing theories leading to an automatic change in styles that introduce, I think, somewhat artificial discontinuities in the science. Now we can address the question that I started with, whether styles are normative or descriptive, right? And there's no question that they can be descriptive, right? And probably that's the way that Crombie and to some extent perhaps hacking have initially thought of them, right? But what I'll try to suggest is that there is nothing that preclude combining both, right? The descriptive and the normative, right? So in that sense, styles can be used to make sense of salient features of scientific practice and having this way a descriptive component. But also, I think they have an evaluative feature, right? It's possible to evaluate different styles and evaluate also the practice done within those styles. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time considering, right? So this normative component can be first understood in terms of the standards of adequacy of the style itself, right? So for example, one can determine whether and to what extent inferential patterns that a style invokes are or are not successful to answer the question the style sets out to address, right? Together with the techniques, procedures, and heuristic resources of the style. So one way is just an internal matter, right? Okay, a style raises certain questions. To what extent are those questions properly answered, given the components of the style, right? The procedures, techniques, heuristic resources, and so on. If they answer correct or successfully, well, so much the better, so much better, but the best for the style. Otherwise, well, that's a problem, right? Second, each style also specifies its own criteria of adequacy and success, right? Because not only you answer, but to what extent are the questions raised about the objects constituted by a style properly answered, right? So you can evaluate how well the answers are settled by the style. Again, relative to the inferential standards, techniques, and procedures and heuristic devices of the style at hand. So both are internal matters, right? Of how well the style achieves what he set out to achieve. Now, and the resources of the styles are crucial, right? To determine that success. And in a way, I think hacking realizes that. In his writings, he talks about a self-indication of a style, right? He talks about a style being self-authenticated. And those are devices in which he's recognizing this kind of internal assessment of a style, right? And someone may say, well, isn't that kind of circular, right? Or isn't that problematic in some way, right? I think it would be problematic if the style meant to provide a kind of foundation for knowledge or for scientific research. But that's not what the style is doing, right? And in a way, the self-indication is a feature that will allow styles to be critically assessed, both in light of its internal coherence and at least comparatively in terms of the adequacy relative to other styles that address the same problems. Of course, not all the styles address it, but some do, right? You may have a physical problem being addressed by the hypothetical style and by the experimental one, right? One making a hypothesis, the other trying to devise an experiment. And of course, in some cases, the styles may overlap. And that often happens as well, right? Now, in that sense, the adequacy of the style is, in a way, sort of set by the style itself. And the worry that this brings in, however, is, well, if it's all sort of internal, don't we end up begging the question in the sense that each style will, of course, end up being successful according to their own standards. And if so, well, that would be a problem, wasn't it? So to address that issue, I think it's crucial to have a concept that cuts across different styles, right? Something that can be invoked and used independently of styles. And I think for that purpose, the notion of evidence is crucial, right? Now, of course, throughout the history of science, including the historical reflections, philosophical reflections about science, we have a variety of different conceptions of evidence, right? I'm mentioning two here, right? Evidence as a sign, for example, right? Some accounts emphasize the way in which the evidence for a phenomenon is part of the process that creates the phenomena in question, right? So you have evidence if you understand this production of the phenomena under consideration. Now, in a number of contexts, this account of evidence may work, but of course it's not generalizable. For example, how about evidence for non-causal situations, such as mathematical theorems, right? There's no creation of the phenomena in those cases, right? Mathematical proofs, they provide evidence for a theorem, but they do not create or cause such a theorem, right? So obviously that's not a notion of evidence that would be applicable across the board. Another conception of evidence, you can call it an alethic conception, right? Evidence has also been thought of as whatever provides good reasons for belief, right? Peter Ackenstein, in the book on evidence, articulates a conception along those lines in probabilistic terms. Now, the worry is that the usual probabilistic formulations of these accounts, again, tends to be applicable only to a very narrow set of cases. It's not surprising that Ackenstein's book, all the examples are primarily given for, card games and things like that, for which we know the probabilities and can determine in ways that are unproblematic. Now, it becomes far more complicated when you need to ask questions such as, okay, what is the probability that Newtonian physics or quantum mechanics is true, right? What is the sample space for things like that, right? And if you want to talk about evidence of those theories, well, then if it's a probabilistic account, we need to be able to answer those questions. The idea, again, I think that's a conception that works in some contexts, but not more generally. So what I'm going to do is I'll try to offer a different account, right? And I'm understanding what I'm suggesting here is something that I think captures a significant aspect of the way that evidence plays out in scientific practice. And it's the idea that what evidence allows us to do is to rule out possibilities, to rule out situations, right? The inspiration from this view, even though that's not the view that he has, came from a passage from David Lewis. Now, I often disagree with almost everything that David Lewis wrote about, but there is this tiny paragraph that I think he was right to some extent, right? He says, the serious business of science has to do not with knowledge per se, but rather with the elimination of possibilities through the evidence of perception, memory, and so on, and with a change that one's belief system would or might or should undergo under the impact of such eliminations. So here, Lewis, this is his paper on elusive knowledge, he's actually after an account of knowledge, not an account of evidence, right? And I think he's right here in saying that science is not in the business of providing knowledge. I think that's quite right? Science is in the business of gathering evidence. And evidence is ultimately a matter of eliminating possibilities, right? And I think that's an important insight here. Now, Lewis goes about and uses this as an account of knowledge to some extent, and I think that's mistaken. But you can formulate that, and that's my proposal, to understand that as an account of evidence, right? So we have evidence for a hypothesis only if we're able to rule out likely possibilities that undermine that hypothesis. So that's the working idea of evidence that I'll be working on. Note that you're ruling out only likely possibilities. You cannot rule out all of them, but some are not relevant, right? So I cannot rule out that I'm a brain in a vat, right? So, but for the purpose of science, I have more reason to believe that, we're having this conversation today, right? And scientists are doing their things in the lab than to believe that I might be a brain in a vat. So of course, this is no response to skepticism, but it is an acknowledgement that, well, you may not be able to rule out all possibilities, but all the likely ones, and that's often good enough. It also indicates that evidence is fallible, right? And that you might be wrong, even though you may have evidence for something. But you may have better evidence and worse evidence. So you can, depending on how successful you are in ruling out those possibilities. So let me try to illustrate how this account works. All right. So this is a typical example, I want to say. This is an image from a transmission electron microscope from 1955 by George Bellotti, right? He was a microscopist, and at that time in the 50s, electron microscopes were sort of well understood, and he said, well, we will try to use them in biology, right? And he started to look at cells using them, and he noticed immediately, and this is actually a pretty good micrograph, even by today's standards, right? He noted the nucleus of the cell, he noted the membranes, all of those things you can see also if you're using an optical microscope. But he noted something that you cannot see with an optical microscope. All these little, particles, right, throughout the membranes, these little dots here. And he was wondering what those things were, right? Initially, he thought, well, maybe this is just an artifact of the method of preparation. So he changed the method of preparation, and the little particles were there. So, well, maybe that depends on the cells from what parts of the body that I'm collecting, or maybe the kind of animal that I'm getting the samples, right? So he changed those things as well, from chickens and mice and so on, different parts of the body, and the little particles were there. So he said, well, it looks as though this is maybe a genuine feature of the sample. He could measure the size of the particle using the electron microscope, and then he put the sample in an ultracentrifuge, and expect to have different sedimentation time, and that's exactly what happened, compatible with the information he got on measuring the size. So he said, looks like this is a genuine new structure. In the paper, he said, we don't know what the chemical composition of it is yet. It looks like it's mostly acid, given the coloring of the preparation in the preparation method, but further chemical analysis needed. 2 years after that, the analysis was done, and it was indeed mostly ribonucleic acid. And now these things are called ribosomes, right? This is a typical case, straightforward case of the kind of evidence by elimination of possibilities at work, right? So note that what Bellotti is doing is to eliminate possibilities that would undermine that this is a genuine feature of the sample, right? So if it's an artifact of the preparation method, for example, or if it's just a feature of some animals or some parts of the body. Now, not every account is like that, right? So let's really illustrate another one, right? So this is a case of a different experiment. This was actually done by a group of chemists at New York University. On the right-hand side, you have the design of the experiments. They were using DNA strands, and they were composing out of those strands some patterns, right, at the nanoscale, right? So if you had, they can compose little triangles. If you have enough of those triangles, you can form a hexagon, enough of those hexagon, and then you have at the bottom here, you have a honeycomb structure. So they would expect to see those things, right? And here on the left, you have, using atomic force microscope, you have the corresponding micrograph, right? And as they say, look, we are seeing the honeycomb structures, right? Well, you are, or are you, right? So it really depends on the way in which those images on the left have actually been constructed, because this is a single molecule tip microscope, right? So the microscope has a tip with a single atom on the tip, and as you scan the surface, the tip will go up and down depending on whatever is it, whatever protrusion there is on the top. But what you get, in effect, then from the instrument is something like this, right? You get on the right, you get the kind of, as you go back and forth scanning, these lines are each time you scan the surface. So that's what you get. And then there is a conversion code that will translate these images into something like that. So for you to say that, oh, we are seeing atoms, or you're seeing the configurations, seems to go beyond what the evidence actually allows you to say, because the way that the configurations look is dependent on the convention codes that are being used in those cases. So it looks as though we do not, to say that we have here, we are seeing those configurations, is unable to rule out the fact that this configuration will look very differently had the right-hand side images being taken, right, rather than the left-hand side. And even here on the left-hand side, if you look, the bottom part of the image seems different from the top. What happened? So you would expect something a little more homogeneous like this. It didn't happen, part because halfway through the experiment, the tip of the microscope broke, right? So you don't get that. So it seems to me that here it's unclear that we do have that kind of experiment. Now, here's another one that is in a way even less successful. This is using the scanning tunneling microscope, right? So you have this single atom tip here, right? And according to this microscope, as you approach the tip of the microscope to a conductive sample, there will be a cloud of electrons bouncing around, and you establish a tunneling current. So if you keep that tunneling current constant and scan the surface of the sample, the tip will go up and down depending on what you can see, what is there. So the team of researchers thought about creating the smallest possible wire, right? A single molecular wire like this. So here's their thought. They're going to have a gold basis, and they're going to paint on top of the gold basis some non-conducting stuff. Then they're going to put a drip of some conducting material that is forming a molecule, a single molecule, if all goes well, right? And there'll be a protruding bit from there. Then the tip of the microscope will come, and when it hits this thing, since this is conducting, this is conducting, and this is conducting, a current will be established, right? And then you will have the smallest possible molecule, right? Or sorry, the smallest possible wire, right? Single molecular wire. And And here's the evidence. Now, if you look at this, say, okay, all right, where are the single molecular wires, right? Well, they are these little blobs here, right? The idea is each of these blobs is such that when the tip of the microscope hit it, it established the current, right? And then it didn't hit again elsewhere. The worry is the following, however. You cannot rule out that these are, say, 2 molecular or even 3 molecular wire rather than a single molecular wire. So you're unable to, the evidence is unable to rule out an important underminer, right? That there is more than a single molecule. I don't deny that those are very small wires, but so the experiment was supposed to establish that there is a single molecular wire, and that has not been done. So the evidence is not enough to rule that out possibility. So for that, you do not have that evidence. So you have in this way an illustration of the ways in which the notion of evidence plays in scientific practice, right? As ruling out, being able to rule out alternatives. If you're able to rule out those likely alternatives, you do have the relevant evidence. If you're unable to do that, you don't. Now, I take it that that's a certain understanding of evidence in terms of ruling out possibilities that can be used as underlying the notion of a style of reasoning, right? The idea would then be that each style would provide its own instantiation of that account of evidence. It's the same notion of evidence in terms of ruling out. But what gets ruled out, what possibilities are ruled out, is dependent on the style at hand. So for example, the deductive style, right? The evidence are established via proofs, and they would exclude, on pain of inconsistency, those results incompatible with the statement of the theorems in question. So that's a notion of evidence for a deductive style that can then be used to determine how successful a certain style has been in answering the questions of that raised by the style, right? The experimental style, the evidence will be provided via experimental controlled procedures, and they would exclude, obviously within the experimental error, the results that undermine the phenomena under consideration. If you're able to do that, you have evidence. If you're unable to do that, such as in the examples I gave a few minutes ago, then you do not have that evidence, right? Palladi had evidence for the ribosomes in a way that the team using the scanning tunneling microscope did not have evidence that they produce a single molecular wire. You have in the hypothetic style, evidence is provided via support of the relevant hypothesis. And they should rule out as much as possible the results that would undermine the hypothesis in question. So you need to be able to do that if you are to have evidence for the hypothesis. Now, in the taxonomic style, the evidence will be obtained via support for the classification provided. And this will rule out those taxonomies that are incompatible with the one in question, right? So whales, for a long time, were thought of as being fish, right? Until biologists figure out that they actually have far more in common with mammals than with fish, right? So that change in classification was supported in part by the way in which it improved the understanding of whales, right? And it sort of rule out those alternatives that were thought of whales just because they are swimming in the ocean, that they should be thought and classified as fish. Now, the statistical styles, the evidence for a hypothesis is obtained by statistical support, right? And if that's done, it will rule out within experimental error results that will undermine the relevant hypothesis. And finally, the evolutionary style, evidence via support for the evolutionary processes that have been identified, which will rule out those processes that are incompatible with the ones that are taken to be present. So, for example, you might be interested in the origin of languages, right? And an evolutionary explanation and account of the of their origin would identify what evolutionary traits are in place, right? And how, if they are in place properly, they would undermine other attempts at explaining the origins of those languages. Now, this gives you a sense of how a notion of evidence in terms of ruling out can be underlying as a feature of styles, right? Now, it's important here, however, to emphasize that evidence is not a characterizing, individuating feature of a style, right? And this is important because if we were to take evidence as what is evidence as part of what the style is, any change of evidence automatically would require a change in style, right? Eventually, it may well do that, but not just automatically by the way that the styles or the evidence were characterized, right? So otherwise, you would end up similarly with what happened with scientific theories. Any changing theories would lead to a change in style. If theories were individuating features of styles, you would have something like that for evidence. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. We want something independent, right? Evidence are independent of styles for the reasons I've indicated, right? And so, and if evidence depended on the styles, then styles would not be an analytic tool that we can use to understand changes of evidence that may not lead to a change in a style, right? Similarly to changes in theory that did not have any corresponding change in style. So we want those things to be separate and independent from one another. Note that what I did was that, so the understanding of evidence I'm suggesting is evidence as ruling out, right? The only way in which this is incorporated in a style is what counts as ruling out, right? And this what counts as ruling out is style dependent, right? But not the notion of evidence, right? In a way, this is similar. You may have similar to a conception of truth. You may have, say, a deflationary conception of truth. So it's the same conception across a variety of contexts where you can use the truth predicate, but that does not tell whether a particular sentence is true or not, right? And we'll have to figure out by whatever means you have of what's going on. So it's important then, for the reasons I've just mentioned, to keep the relative independence between theories and evidence, right, from styles, right? And in this way, we can talk about what is evidence, how it was obtained, how it was assessed, as part of the understanding of the adequacy of the evidence itself, right? And that's, I take it, a really important feature of scientific practice. Okay, to conclude, I think styles of reasoning not only provide a descriptive tool to analyze salient features of scientific practice and the history of science, but also they provide an interesting and important normative framework to assess critically various aspects of their practice, right? As I tried to indicate, I think evidence, despite the differences across styles, can be used as a normative component to implement such an assessment, right? So relative to the available evidence that support is given by the heuristic role of a given style, so that we can determine whether certain style successfully or not answer a question that it posed. Furthermore, as I also note, the internal evaluation of the coherence of a style also addresses the normative dimension, right? And that's done by examining the connections between, on the one hand, the techniques, procedures, and heuristic resources for problem solving that a style has, and on the other hand, the questions that the style raises, right? That kind of internal assessment, how successful a style is in answering the question, is of course important. And that's supported by the external assessment provided by an evidence that is gathered independently of the style, So I think in these two ways, styles, in these two complementary ways, styles provide resources for the normative assessment of scientific practice beyond just its description. So in that way, styles provide both an important descriptive tool, but also normative considerations to assessment of both particular aspects of scientific practice, but also the adequacy of styles themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Otávio. Thank you. Now we have time for questions. I ask audience just please raise hands. So you click on this participant button, and then you may raise it. Я скажу по-русски, пожалуйста, давайте, у нас есть время на вопросы. Если кто-то, если кому-то удобнее задавать их на русском языке, я могу перевести. И могу перевести обратно ответ. И, пожалуйста, поднимайте руки. Вот там есть... уже есть какой-то вопрос. Okay, so we have a question which came in chat. Yeah, what about the empirical equivalence in case of theories evaluation? What is evidence in this case of empirical equivalence?
Oh, good. Thanks, Alexander. This is a very good question, right? So, of course, if two theories are empirically equivalent, then we are not in a position, obviously, to distinguish them empirically, right? So in that case, the evidence is not discriminative enough to do that. And that's just a fact of the way that the equivalence will go, right? Or the evidence will go. So we will be unable, in that case, of settling the issue. So we will normally, what you do in these cases, you look for more evidence, right? Evidence of a larger scope that would be able to settle the difference between the theories. And if you're unable to do that, well, then you, on empirical basis, you cannot choose among those theories, right? And that will be just a fact of the science at hand, right? So.
Thank you. Some more questions?
Well, I see one there. Someone, I think, well, Alexander also asked about Chrome DUAM, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
so, yeah, you're quite right in asking. DUAM did talk about the English mind, the French minds, and I would not consider those things styles, right? In part because I think the way he was thinking about, or at least in the way he formulated, perhaps we could reformulate it in a different way. But the way they were formulated, we get something a little more psychological, right? So it's a certain way of just thinking about certain phenomena, right? You may think about in the way that Joanne was thinking, well, the English mind are thinking about examples, right? And particular cases that they try to generalize. And you have those sort of are more theoretically oriented that approach things from the top down instead. And so these would fit into sort of heuristic devices in the way so it was a component of a style. I wouldn't think that it's enough to characterize a style, right? Because in effect, those are two different heuristic strategy that you develop in order to try to solve a problem. And I think that's what, in a way, Joanne was trying to get at. But I think to have a style, you need something a little broader than that, right? A little more systematic than what Joanne provided, right? And although it's very telling, I think Joanne did some really interesting work, and he was sensitive to some nuances in scientific change that I think are important. But I want styles to be broader units of analysis, right? And so an heuristic strategy, it will be part of a style. It wouldn't in itself characterize a single style per se.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have a question.
Thank you, Otávio.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Alexander.
yeah. I have a question. Yeah, if I understood correctly your argument, so you made it clear what you mean by style, then you pointed that it has a descriptive function, of course, but also normative function. But then if I understand the argument correctly, or correct me, so that's kind of internal normativity, which has no really like external foundation. So we need really some, as you put it, something goes across, kind of orthogonal concept, and you in that concept you talk about evidence, right? Which which is not style dependent, even if it somehow transforms in different style in different ways. But that's my question. Actually, I recently came across probably book by Maurice Cohen, who was professor in Columbia University, immigrant from Odessa in the end of 19th century. And his more famous student, Ernst Nagel, and they have kind of logic textbook. And then they give definition of what is logic, which I liked. And they say, logic is a way to determine best evidence. So their conception of logic really is centered, focused on evidence, which somehow I think very, very convincing. But actually my question is that even we may think about that understanding of logic or not, but it looks like evidence is not something isolated, right? It does work in isolation. So you need kind of environment, call it logic of evidence or something, which kind of works with evidence, right? And again, that is not matter of style, it's say matter of logic. And so so I don't know, you just chosen evidence as the most important part of that, or do you agree that actually evidence is just a part of a larger story which is orthogonal to style, so to speak?
Good.
How you think about it? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrei. This is an excellent question too, and because of course I think logic is involved in a style, right? In the standards of reasoning, the third component of a style involves a logic. As I said, maybe it's deductive or inductive, analogical. There's some kind of inferential procedure is there. So I think we need that if we're talking about reasoning, right? We cannot talk sensibly about reasoning without talking about logic, right? But it seems to me that evidence is different from logic, right? We may need logic in order to determine the bearing of the evidence on something, but the evidence itself is something independent of the logic, right? So think about what was the evidence for the existence of ribosomes in the example I gave, right? The evidence was a micrograph that showed the tiny little particles there. Now that micrograph is there independently of what we think about it, independently of what Palade thought about it, independent of any reasoning that we have done about it, right? Now, in order for us to be able to assess the bearing of that micrograph on the existence of ribosomes itself, we may need to do some reasoning. And in fact, Palade did, right? When he reasoned, right, if I were to ultracentrifuge this sample, I should get different sedimentation times. He was doing a little reasoning there, right? And he was using logic in order then to determine the bearing of the evidence, right? And but I think that the two things are separate, right? Because the evidence is not given by the logic. The evidence given by the micrograph, right? The fact that we can detect those little particles on the surface of the image. And that's what gave the evidence at the end. Because otherwise, we may be in a position of confusing, right, our reasoning about the evidence with the evidence itself. And those are two different things. You may have good evidence, but do a poor reasoning from it, right? You may have bad evidence and did a good reasoning from it, right? So, and those two are separate things, I want to say.
Well, frankly, I'm not fully convinced because look, do you accept that evidence is epistemic notion, right? It's not ontic. We are not talking just about like physical objects like photograph, right? We are talking evidence is epistemic notion. It's something that gives impact on our brain, whatever, in our mind, okay? And if it's so, then of course we may distinguish between, say, kind of direct evidence, right, and reasoning, but I would be accurate. I think we shouldn't think like, you know, early logical positivists that there are kind of sense data and reasoning, right? It's very much intervened.
Yeah, no, I don't believe in sense data, right? I think sense data is the example of philosophical fiction, right? That and one that didn't go down very well, right? But I don't think when I'm talking about evidence, I'm invoking sense data, right? I'm thinking about features in the world, right? That what gave evidence for the existence of ribosome was the micrograph.
So evidence is not epistemic in your sense, right?
Well, it is epistemic in the sense, well, it has an epistemic component, but it cannot be just epistemic because it needs to have a contribution of the world. Otherwise, it's not going to be objective.
Right.
I need something that is independent of me, that I'm relying on, in order then to show that the evidence does what it does. And that's the component, the objective component that I think is needed for us to have proper evidence, right? And then we reason about. And in that reasoning, of course, evidence is epistemic in the sense that it gives us some connection with the way things are, right? But we need to do that, we need the way things are independently of us.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.